How have you found fame change you? What's been impacted or changed due to the scrutiny and the surveillance and the adoration and the criticism?
Well, the first thing that changed, I think, was that I saw misery on a scale that I hadn't really seen it before. I had worked as a clinician for a long time, and I worked with, say, 20 people a week. And I was always in the realm of difficult existential problems, wrestling with my clients' problems alongside of them. And I liked that a lot. And then I had my research and I had my family and various business interests. And so that misery in some ways was contained and boxed in. And I had a lot of structure around that to be able to function despite the fact that, I was neck deep in 20 people's serious problems, which I really liked, by the way. When I started speaking on a larger scale and meeting more and more people, this scale of demoralization really hit me. I didn't know how deep the demoralization in our culture had become. And I think that was especially obvious to me at that point among young men. Now, it looks like, this is Jonathan Haidt's research is indicating this, that possibly young women are even in worse shape. But for whatever reason, most of the people I was meeting, at least to begin with, were young men. I think it was probably because most of them, far more people on YouTube, are young men. And so it was shocking and brutal to see how much demoralization, how widely spread the demoralization in our culture was. Other than that, and that was a real shock, and it was very hard on me, I would say. Everything else about it has been, at minimum, ridiculously interesting. I have an unbelievable wealth of opportunity. I'd be a fool to be anything but abjectly grateful. I mean, the misery that I saw was a shock, and it hurt me, and it was part of what made me ill.
How did that impact you? Did it change the way that you see the world at all?
It made me understand more deeply how important it was to offer people an encouraging word. I could see that so many people were dying psychologically or actually for lack of an encouraging word. And so it made being in the position to provide that much more necessary. I mean, part of the reason that Tammy and I tour constantly is because it seems to be good. It seems to be a good thing. We've even seen changes in the audience. So 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when we did our first tour, a lot of the people who came to the talks were in pretty rough shape. There were more men than there are now, like the proportion of men to women was higher. And the men were generally there alone, and a lot of them were looking pretty ragged around the edges. And now, 5 years later, half the audience comes in suits. Like it's as if they're dressed for a wedding. Most of the guys are there with some woman. The audience members are doing much better, and the lecture events are extremely positive. If you looked at my life from the outside, you'd think that I was in a constant storm of, aggravated controversy, but all of that, virtually all of that, is virtual. It's just in the online world. Now, it touches the actual world from time to time because I am being pursued by my regulatory college in Ontario.
Camp.
Yeah, which is, mostly just an annoyance and a preposterous annoyance, a preposterous, expensive, and time-consuming annoyance. But apart from that, everything that's happened around me has been positive. That's a strange thing too. Positive at such an intensity that even that is daunting. You'd think, it's hard to imagine that you could be in a situation where things are so positive that you can barely stand it. But I am in that situation, and it's quite something to contend with. I was fortunate, I suppose, to some degree that it didn't happen to me till I was old, because I've never really got accustomed to it.
I've had a thought about this, observing what's happened to you, and the Weinsteins are a good example of this too. We often hear the perils of getting fame too young. The Macaulay Culkins of the world, the Britney Spears of the world, individuals who don't have any sense of identity being thrust into a non-representative experience of the world, and they're completely unmoored. But I think that there's an equally interesting question to ask, okay, and what happens if you think you know who you are? If you've spent decades, 5 decades, 6 decades of your life understanding your place, your status, the trajectory that you're on, and then out of nowhere, you get ripped away from all of the areas of reference, all of the waymarkers that you thought you knew, and now you're just floating in the air. I imagine that could be even more disquieting in some ways.
Well, when everything blew up around me to begin with, it was stressful, I would say, because my job was on the line, my university job, and I never thought that would happen. I mean, when I worked at Harvard and at the University of Toronto, that was all positive. Like, I really liked working with my graduate students. I had at least cordial relationships with my fellow faculty members. At Harvard, they were more than cordial. At the University of Toronto, most of the faculty members that I started to develop friendships with were also those who ended up moving away. And they were often people who got offers from other places, and they would disappear. And so a lot of the friends I developed at the University of Toronto went elsewhere. And so I didn't get as tightly tied in with regards to friendship networks among my peers as I had at Harvard, for example. But I had great relationships with undergraduates and with my graduate students. That was plenty. Like, I loved working with my graduate students. And so it wasn't like I was pining and alone, not at all. And I had a good network of friends. And so then that was threatened and really disappeared in 2016. And my clinical practice was threatened. And so that was unsettling. I think there were things that continued, though. Even when I was teaching as a university professor, the way I taught wasn't typical. The things I taught weren't typical. I thought for decades, eventually someone's going to find out what I'm teaching, and there's going to be trouble. I couldn't believe I was allowed, encouraged to teach what I was teaching. But, the universities, and this was particularly true of Harvard in the 90s, that's how they were structured.
What was so rebellious about what you were teaching?
Well, there wasn't really anybody who was concentrating on the nexus between, say, archetypal and religious ideas in neuroscience. So that wasn't a thing. I mean, there was a few people, Jaak Panksepp was one of them, who a lot of the researchers who were interested in the neuroscience of emotion became interested in deep narrative, because they started to understand that our emotional life is a story. That's a good way of thinking about it. And that we're guided by our emotional instincts. And what our emotional instincts do is put us into certain stories. That's what it means to be in love, for example, is that you're in a love story. And
it's not a particular balance of oxytocin and endorphins that you are aware of. It's not broken down to its constituent parts.
No, definitely not.
It's part of a narrative that you tell yourself about what this means and how this feels.
Right. Well, and it's interesting that the instinct manifests itself as a story. And so I was very interested in narrative and story. And also, see, no psychologist studied Carl Jung, like literally, virtually none.
Really?
Now, oh yeah, no, definitely not. I mean, psychology really developed in some ways as the materialist antithesis to psychoanalysis. So Freud and Jung, and even Adler to some degree, they were off limits for scientifically trained behavioral psychologists. And that's what I was and am. Like, I trained at McGill. There were no courses in psychoanalytic theory at McGill. I read Freud and Jung completely on my own, flying in the face of the advice that I was getting even from my well-meaning graduate supervisor, who was a great guy and who never got in my way in the least, quite the contrary. But I was warned, for example, when I went on the job market, not to talk about the things that I was truly interested in. And I ignored that, by the way. And what that meant was some places that I went to apply for a job didn't want me, but then Harvard did. So that worked out quite nicely. And that's one of the advantages too, also of being true to your own vision, is that you won't get what you don't want. See, I didn't want to go work somewhere where they wouldn't want me. I wanted to go work somewhere where they wanted me. So my strategy was, well, this is who I am. And if you don't want me, that's a drag because I'm looking for a job. But by the same token, I'm not going to pretend to be someone other than who I am so I can work here. What a stupid way of starting your career.
Well, that goes back to the truth, right? Telling the truth. What are you going to, if you tell a sufficiently seductive lie, what is the best that you can hope for?
Right.
The person that you are telling the lie to falls in love with the projection.
Right, absolutely. Well, when I applied to graduate school, I wrote a crazy admissions letter, and I basically laid out who I was, flaws and all, and what I was interested in. And 3 people bit. And the one that I liked best, partly because he was at McGill and I wanted to be in Montreal, was my graduate supervisor, Robert Peel, and he knew what he was getting. And we had a great time. I still work with him. I had one of the best relationships with Bob that I've ever had with anyone in my life, and it's lasted 4 decades. And it was because, Bob's a very honest person. We were very different. He's very practical. He's a very good administrator, a managerial type, although he's super smart. He had an exhaustive knowledge of the relevant research psychology literature. And I came in, flying on a mat of psychoanalytic theory and philosophy and religious ideas, very, very different, although we shared a real deep interest in the practicalities of research, and he taught me how to fall in love with the more scientific end of the research distribution. But the point I'm making is that he knew what he was getting right from the beginning, and so did I. And that worked like a charm. There was no reason for any sort of subterfuge. And it turned out that his talents and mine dovetailed extremely well. So, and we had a blast. I loved working with, that's why we've been working together for 40 years. I traveled all over North America with Bob because we also started a business, and it was great. It was great. The thing is, if you tell people who you are and an opportunity opens up, it opens up for you.
Yes.
Not for this thing you've created, this lie.
We'll get back to talking to Jordan in 1 minute, but first I need to tell you about Element. I've used Element every single morning for over 3 years now. It is the way I start every single day. It tastes fantastic. It optimizes my hydration. It helps to regulate my appetite, and it improves my brain health. Element contains a science-backed electrolyte ratio of sodium, potassium, and magnesium. Best of all, they've got a brand new chocolate caramel flavor, which you can have hot. Hot Element, I hear you say. What sort of hydration blasphemy is this? But no, it tastes fantastic, and on cold mornings, it's perfect. There is a no BS, no questions asked refund policy, so you can buy it and try it completely risk-free. And if you do not like it for any reason, they will give you your money back, and you don't even need to return the box. I've used this every single morning for as long as I can remember, and that orange flavor is phenomenal. Plus, that chocolate caramel is available right now if you go to the link in the show notes below, or head to drinklmnt.com/modernwisdom for a free sample pack of all 8 flavors with your first box. That's drinklmnt.com/modernwisdom. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that clip with Jordan, you will love the over 3-hour-long podcast episode, which is available right here. Go on. Give it a tap.